So much for your kind invitation. Today I will talk about a topic which is very frequent in journalist questions. Is there any literature in Esperanto? And to do so, I will go back to the early days of Esperanto and the cultural milieu that was in the fin de siècle in Europe. So, without further ado, let's start. Okay, I will talk about the language ideologies around Esperanto, because in the case of planned languages or invented languages or constructed languages that you prefer, they are languages that the speakers choose to use. The role of language ideology is always very important. And all the time that you are choosing a language is never only about language. It is about the social practices. So which kind of persons use languages, what kind of social groups, and so on. So this is one of the basic, let's say, theoretical pillars. And the other is the concept of community of practice. What is a community of practice? It's a social group in which members are there not because of abstract characteristics, but because they choose to do something practical. So that term came out from studies in sociology about religious groups, so people who go to the church and participate to mass and all the other surrounding activities for the community, but also was extended to games. For example, chess players all around the world are a community of practice because they play chess, they identify themselves playing chess and talking about chess. So there is the object level and the meta level, which is talking about the practice itself. So these are the two theoretical pillars that we use today. So before Esperanto, so what is the cultural milieu that we are talking about? So this is mainly a European story because at first this comes from Europe and then it became spread worldwide after the fin de siècle. The first thing I want to talk to you about is Volapük. Volapük was invented by Johann Martin Schleyer, who was a Catholic priest. And you can see that he has this kind of sacred book about Volapük in his hand. And he claimed to having received the language in a dream by God directly. So he had a very peculiar idea of what this war language, because Volapük means war language, should be for. So he claimed that the war language with the war grammar was out in 1879 in an obscure Catholic review in the south of Germany, in a very, let's say, important moment of German history, because that was the Kulturkampf. So Catholics were divided into people loyal to the Pope and people loyal to Bismarck, who had unified the country. So the more traditionalists were loyal to the Pope, while the more progressive in modern terms were more loyal to Bismarck. And Schleyer was a traditionalist. So that key tells you a lot about him. The point is that for him it was language to talk to God. So you can see here, God beginnen oss absurd din is valik, mit Gott lasst uns beginnen alle Dinge, with God all things start. And he envisaged the language for sacred things, because it was a sacred language. The first adopter of Volapük had different ideas, and in particular, Professor August Kerkhoffs, a Dutchman educated in France, wanted, on the contrary, to use the language for international commerce. You can see international commercial language, and this is the first book for English-speaking people published in Chicago. And he had some goals for Volapük, which is international commerce, tool for diplomacy fostering peace, educate the masses, which is, let's say, universal education, alphabetization in the language, using language for science, for scientific discovery, and for tourism, traveling. So these are the 5 pillars for him. Interestingly, in that introduction of that book, you can see here that he claims that literary man appear to agree in denying its utility. So what does it mean? It means that for him, thinking that Volapük can become the new Latin or the new Greek for a universal literature is not something important. The other pillar, at the same time, completely independent, is by Hudson Macaulay Posnet, a pioneer in comparative literature, who has this book in the context of British colonialism, and he envisaged world literature after classic literature. So he thought that it is the time to go beyond national literatures because we are globalizing. It's the age of the first globalization. Think about the telephone, the telegraph, cinema, automatic photography with Kodak, all the new technologies in the age when the big players of colonialism had conquered all the world. And so he defines world literature as universalizing of literature, like Greek, Latin, Hebrew, Arabic, Hindi, and Chinese. So the paradoxical result is that there is no intersection with Volapük. According to the study by Johanna Pink of the Volapük Qumran, one of the few non-Christian texts in Volapük, you have especially grammar and vocabulary books published in Volapük and some translations, significant number of translation of classic literatures, but a marginal attempt to produce original literature in Volapük. So there is no idea of producing something like that. On the contrary, Esperanto is a language constructed through the idea of world literature. So the standard storytelling of the genesis of Esperanto is synthesized by this comic book or graphic novel, if you prefer, that I wrote as a script. And the point here is that there is Zamenhof, the founder of Esperanto, who explains that in his birth town, Białystok, which is a small town close to the Belarus border in Poland nowadays, but at the time it was part of the Tsarist Empire. There were 4 ethnic groups. You can see there on the bottom, the Polish, the Russian, the Germans, and the Jews, with 4 religions: Catholic, Orthodox, Lutherans, and of course Judaic. Through all his life, Zamenhof wanted to build 2 bridges. One bridge should be the religious bridge, so a common religion, and the second, a common language. The common religion didn't work, or better said, it was not received, while the common language eventually became Esperanto. So he had this very strong, let's say, moral and, if you want, messianic idea. So in his first book, published in Russian in Warsaw, you can see here Warsaw in Cyrillic scripts. His name was under pseudonym Doctor Esperanto. You can more or less read it here, which is the one who hopes. And if we go to that book, which I have here actually as a reproduction, it's very small. It's a very small book. The first texts you can find in Esperanto are exactly this. Patronia en ella Biblio. Patronia kiu estas en la cielo. Sancta estu via nomo, venu regetso via, estu volo via, qui en la cielo, tiel ankaŭ sur la terra. This is the beginning of Our Father. And then you have, iera comenzo Dio creis la teron cae la cielon. Cae la tero estis en forma cae deserta, cae mallumo estis super la profundaĵo, cae l'animo de Dio sin portis super la akvo. And this is Genesis, the creation. So you can see that translations were immediately there with the 2 pillars of the Christian and Jewish literature, if you want, which is Our Father and Genesis. 2 pages later, after a letter, you see an original poem written by him. Mia penso, it means my thought. Sur la campo for del mondo anta un octo de somero, amichino e la rondo, cantas canton per il spero. Cai privivo detruita ci raccontas compatante, mia vundo refrapita, min doloras resangante. I hope you can appreciate the prosody. So, he built up the structure of Esperanto on an aesthetic principle. It should be nice to the ear. You should be able to write good poems. That's completely different from Schleier's Volapük idea. And in a famous letter to Michaud, a pioneer of French Esperantists in 1905, he explains the genesis of Esperanto, and I have translated that for you. And he recalls that he loved Russian, the Russian language, and he wanted to become a Russian poet when he was a kid. He even wrote a 5-act tragedy when he was 10, can you imagine? And he says, I can freely talk only 3 languages, Russian, Polish, and German. But the point is that he had this poetic mindset. And of course, the topics of his poetry are universal. In the fabric of Esperanto, the concept of world literature is already there. So after the launch, we see that the pioneers of Esperanto speakers, especially Esperanto intellectuals, wanted to find an international style. How do you write a good text in Esperanto? Because there is no clear reference. If I want to learn how to write a good text in English, I have the classics to read, and I copy the style. But how to do that in Esperanto? Of course, Zamenhof is the first classic, if you want, in Esperanto. But it is not enough. And in 1905, in Boulogne-sur-Mer, a small town on the Channel, on the French border, close to Calais, it happened, the foundational myth of the community of practice. What is the foundational myth? Why I say so? Because a community of practice is a kind of imagined community in the sense of Benedict Anderson. An imagined community is a community of people in which you can't know personally each member. You know your family members. You can put them in a clear network, but you can't know all people living in Glasgow. But you have an idea of what a prototypical person in Glasgow is, or for me, an Amsterdamer. So I am myself an Amsterdamer, and I have an idea what is an Amsterdamer, but I cannot really know all people in Amsterdam. So Amsterdam as a community is imagined. And you have to conceive stereotype. So this is what happened in 1905 for the Esperantists. And in that moment, where for the first time, people from more than 20 countries gathered together, almost 700 people, and at that time it was a lot, from different countries and speaking Esperanto for the first time together. So that impressed a lot the media of the time. There were some intellectuals who had speeches about who we are as Esperantists. And one of them is Casimir Bain, called Cabe. This is a satirical portrait in Literatura Almanacco in 1909. This is the entry in the Encyclopedia of Esperanto in 1933 by Koloman Kaloce. We'll talk about him later. And this is my raw translation in English. He was Polish, an oculist like Zamenhof. He wrote many scholarly books and articles, and in the Esperanto war, he became famous under the pseudonym Cabe by means of translation of classics from Polish literature. Then he abandoned the movement, and no one knows exactly why. But nonetheless, he made a very solid trace into the Esperanto culture. And this excerpt of his discourse in Boulogne-sur-Mer in 1905 has a couple of passages that are very important. He said that the phraseology is already enriched by the use of the first generation, more or less 25 years, 1887, 905, and the principle of internationality. That means that in order to write in good Esperanto, you have to know at least 3 languages, one Romance, one Germanic, and one Slavic. So you find a mix balanced. And he said in particular, and it was that in an interview later in Literatura Mondo, that Esperanto benefits from translations more than original free writing. So he was a bit, let's say, disappointed by the fact that Esperantists wanted to produce original literature, and that it may be one of the reasons why he left the movement. We can say that in the first generation, translations were most important. So we have to wait for the next generation, so the end of the Belle Époque, the fin de siècle, after the First World War. because after the First World War, empires fell, the Tsarist Empire, the Ottomans, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. All the map of Europe was completely redesigned. There was a new hub of Esperanto culture in Budapest by a rich man Teodoro Schwarz, who, let's say, financed the publication of this review, kind of luxury at the time. Teodoro Schwarz is the Esperanto Germanic name of Tivadar Soros, the father of George Soros, actually. And he was saved by Esperanto. And it's a very interesting story, but I cannot tell that now because that put us off the race. But the point is that there was the first reflection on how to produce original literature in a mature way. And in the second number, in November of 1922, we have this article by Alexandru Gisvain, another Hungarian, a Christian socialist, Catholic priest, pacifist, and feminist. And the title Esperanto kaj mondliteraturo means exactly Esperanto and world literature. And in this article, the author starts from Weltliteratur by Goethe, in contrast to the Herderian idea of national literature as development of national character. And in particular, he defines why Esperanto conception of mondliteraturo, world literature, is different. So this is the excerpt in original, and this is the translation. He says that the human culture is a big orchestra, and each individual nations are soloists, while Esperanto is a combination of the national literatures. So it's an organ that combines the most diverse sounds of the instruments. It replaces a full orchestra. When you translate something into Esperanto, you Esperantize it in a sense. And then you produce in Esperanto for a genuinely worldwide public, which is not linked especially to a national background. For example, I have led the translation of one of Claudio Madri's novels, and he is an Italian author from Trieste, which was a hub of Austrian-Hungarian culture. And I had to put a lot of footnotes for the international public, because if I have an Esperantist from Vietnam, he or she may not be able to know what does it mean, a song by a Triestinian soldier in the local dialect, because all the background of Trieste is kind of understandable by someone from Italy, more or less, but from China or Vietnam or Arusha in Tanzania, it could be impossible to understand. And this is how you have to adapt in the translations the national masterpieces. While when you write in Esperanto, you write with a mindset that this should be understandable to everybody. So you put your national character behind you, not in front. This is the big difference. And this is why, according to Alexandru Gisvain, Koloman Kalocai, who was the regisseur, the director of this literature enterprise, the idea is that Esperanto creates something that is from the start world literature. Why when you use a national language, that is not the same. It's impossible. To summarize my main points, Esperanto literature was built up in the long fin de siècle because Volapük failed to, let's say, fulfill this need. Both Schleier's pious and religious view, and on the other side, Kercho's mundane goals for utilitaristic use of the international language, both did not consider the role of literature as identity building tool for the community of practice. At the same time, Posnet was defining world literature as universal, so why not to use a universal between, let's say, quoting Marx, language for a world literature. And that is the moment in which there is the intersection with Esperanto. Zamenhof understood that very clearly, carved the language out of an aesthetic principle, and his style was heavily influenced by masterpieces of Russian and German poetry. And then, thanks to Kolochai, more, let's say, and especially his translation of Dante's Inferno, more Romance and Italian style came in. But the point is that until then, so that we need a full generation from 1887 to 1922, to understand that we need a style of Esperanto, a genuinely Esperanto style, which should be international, and we should pay our attention to Kabe, even if then he left the movement, but he really put the prose as the basic. The maturity of the idea of mondliteraturo came up after the end of the Belle Époque, so after a reconstruction of the Esperanto movement in Europe after the tragedy of the Great War. Like national language, Esperanto does not belong to a specific ethnic or social group, and that is why it attracted, since the beginning, people who wanted to have an international mindset different from a colonial one. So an anti-colonial mindset, we can say, absolutely. So thank you for your kind attention, and I'm ready to answer your questions.